Hi, my name is Kate, and today I'm going to teach you guys about bias. So let's start with introduction. Student K from CCV Middle School wants to know who is the most popular person. Student K puts question sheet that says, for 3 years, student R was the most popular person in CCV Middle School. Who is the most popular person in CCV Middle School this year? And 50 post-its on cafeteria table, which is closest to the door. He collected the post-its after lunch, and the result was student R. Do you think student R is the most popular person in CCV Middle School and the result is valid? In order to find out whether the result is valid or not, there's a really efficient tool to use in statistics, which is bias. Well, bias is technically not a tool, but it's more of an indicator to find out whether the sampling was a valid or not. Now you guys would wonder, well, then what is bias? What is sampling? And what does that mean when you're saying something is valid? We'll get to that in today's lesson. Before we actually start the lesson, let me briefly introduce you guys to what we're going to cover today. So, first, you guys will understand the concept of bias in sampling and be able to define it. You have to understand 4 types of bias, which are voluntary response bias, undercoverage bias, non-response bias, and response bias. And then you guys will be able to distinguish each type of bias and be able to indicate the difference among different types of biases. As well as you guys will be able to identify 4 types of bias in mathematical questions and real-world situations. Also, you guys should be able to solve statistics problems which contain the concept of bias, make sense of problems, and persevere in solving them. So if you guys are ready, let's get into today's lesson. First of all, what is bias? It means any systematic failure of a sampling method to represent its population. I'm pretty sure all of you guys know what systematic failure means. It might sound really fancy, but it basically means just a failure. But you guys might have a question. Then what is sampling? Sample is a representative subset of a population examined in the hope of learning about the population. It might sound very complicated, but what it means is really simple. It's basically saying if you want to find out some types of information from a group, you need a certain group of people who's kind of representing the entire population, because if you want to research the entire population, it will take more time and more energy. So the representative subset, which means just basically representative group, will help you to find out information about the entire population more easily. Then let me show some example question about sampling. Pause the video and try to answer the question. The answer is D, which means that the appropriate sample for a study interested in the average interest rates on home loans from a national bank is a random sample of 1,000 loan rates from 100 randomly selected branches nationally. Sample size is large enough since it contains 100 samples from 1,000 population, and also it is randomly selected samples, which means there's less possibility for bias to occur. Sample survey is basically a study that asks questions of a sample population in the hope of learning something about the entire population. So this is basically what we were looking for when we first learned about sample. The example will be polls taken to access voter preference, which is to search the preference of voters by selecting group of people. Then now we should look at the example bias sample, which means that the sampling has an error and it's inaccurate. Kathy wants to know how many students in her city use the internet for learning purposes. She used an email poll. Based on the replies to her poll, she found that 83% of those surveyed used the internet. Kathy's sample is biased as she surveyed only the students, those who used the internet, so it couldn't cover the entire population of students. Also, she should have randomly selected a few schools and colleges in the city to conduct the survey, since she's only using the result of survey that she received the email back from. As I already taught you guys, bias is any systematic failure of a sampling method to represent its population. So basically means that the sample that we gather to find out some type of information was invalid and inaccurate because there was some error. Bias sampling methods tends to over or underestimate the parameters, so it cannot have accurate data, and there are four types of bias. Now we'll take a closer look at those four types of bias. Bias type 1 is non-response bias. It is a bias that introduced when a large fraction of those sampled fails to respond, and those who do not respond are likely to not represent the entire population. It's basically saying that the sample is invalid and inaccurate because there was an error occurred by people who didn't answer to the survey questions. We are doing the survey or study in order to find out information about entire population. But if someone, especially a large portion of samples, fail to respond to the questions, then we cannot get the entire population's opinion or information about them. Imagine that you were only able to collect 30% of your sample's responses. That you're uncertain that whether or not the result that you collected are representing entire population, or you're even unsure that it's a valid result since about 70% of population failed to respond to your question. So you're uncertain about such information about 70%, which means that your result that consists of only 30% of sample is invalid. Now let's look at some example of non-response bias. So the example for a non-response bias would be that those who are at work during the day will not respond to a telephone survey conducted only during the working hours. Then the result of survey is not valid since it kind of discriminate those who are working during the day. We cannot fully trust the result because we couldn't include those who work at daytime, and the result is invalid therefore. Let's take a look at second type of bias. The second type of bias is called voluntary response bias. It's a type of non-response bias when individuals can choose on their own whether to participate in the sample or not. It occurs. Samples based on voluntary response are always invalid and cannot be recovered no matter how large the sample size. As you can tell from the name itself, voluntary response bias occurs when people are voluntarily respond to the survey questions. When people are voluntarily answering to the questions or survey, then it's more likely to be that the opinions of those who responded to survey will be really extreme. And it is really hard to say that those extreme opinions represent entire population. Since it occurs because the researcher failed to collect the opinion of entire population or only succeeded to collect a certain amount of data, it is part of non-response bias since it mostly contains those who kind of voluntarily responded to the survey. In voluntary response bias, sample fails to represent entire populations. So no matter how large it is, the result is still invalid since many error doesn't mean that it's inaccurate and correct data. Voluntary response bias is very common and it often occurs in various situations. Let's take a look at examples. The most common example would be call-in radio shows that solicit audience participation in surveys on controversial topics such as abortion, affirmative action, or gun control, etc. The resulting sample tends to overrepresent individuals who have strong opinions. Call-in radio show is based on people's voluntary participation. So it's more likely that people with extreme or dynamic opinion will likely to call a radio show to portray their opinion rather than just people with general or milder opinion. Therefore, it is hard to say that those data collected voluntarily represent entire population's opinion. It is rather the opinion of certain individuals with the strong and extreme opinions, and therefore there is an error that to the data that's collected. Since the sample contains error and it cannot represent the entire population, we say there is a voluntary response bias, and therefore the result or collected data are invalid and fail to represent the entire population. Now let's take a look at third type of bias. Bias type 3 is response bias. So it occurs when anything in a survey design that influences responses falls under the heading of response bias. One typical response bias arises from the wording of questions, which may suggest a favored response. In this case, the collected data from sample are invalid or inaccurate because the way the questions asked is somewhat influences the sample's opinion, and therefore made it invalid. Rather than collecting completely pure, I would say, opinion about sample, it rather kind of, shaped them to answer to the survey question in certain ways. Even though the surveyor doesn't necessarily try to manipulate the result, even without noticing it, they can still influence sample to answer in certain ways. Therefore, it is really common to occur, and bias is present in response because it's inaccurate since it fails to represent the entire population, since it gathered incorrect information that's shaped by or manipulated by the researcher or other person. So it's hard to say that the response is purely based on the sample's opinion, and therefore it's inaccurate and invalid. There's error in the sample. Let's take a look at an example of response bias. The example would be that voters are more likely to express support of the president than support of the particular person holding that office at the moment. So the wording of question that contains the word the president influence voters to express more support rather than just talking about a name or position of a certain person for the candidates. So another example would be that when someone's asking question about teenager brushing their teeth, they can ask, in US, the certain institution says that people have to brush their teeth at least 3 times a day. How many times or how often do you brush your teeth? Then people are more likely to answer that they at least brush their teeth 3 times per day. And it can be made up, and it can be accurate since they were influenced by the question and couldn't honestly present their opinion. Therefore, it failed to represent the entire population's opinion. Let's take a look at last type of bias. The bias type 4 is undercoverage bias, and I would say that it is most tricky and kind of confusing concept to understand. It's a sampling scheme that biases the sample in a way that gives a part of the population less representation than it has in the population. So it occurs when some members of your population aren't represented in a sample. Some members of a population have zero chance of being included in the survey or experiment. Even though it sounds really complicated, what it means is very simple. So it basically says that the sample that we collected to find the information about entire population failed to cover entire population or failed to represent the entire population because the sample couldn't include or it even excludes a certain group of people when they're gathering samples. So it fails to represent the entire population since it couldn't give a chance to every possible people in the population. The sample couldn't really represent the population since it couldn't give opportunity. It didn't give an equal opportunity for every member of sample who will possibly represent the entire population. Therefore, the result is invalid, and we assume that the sample contains error to represent the entire population, and we don't really trust the result that's collected. Now let's take a look at some samples for undercoverage bias. At first glance, collecting data at a mall or town meeting might seem like a convenient way of getting the data you need. However, by only asking shoppers at a mall about their opinions, you risk undercoverage of several populations. For example, people who only shop locally, or people who are housebound, or people who don't like the mall, they cannot be included in your sample, and therefore it is hard to say that your sample represents entire population's opinion because you excluded or discriminated some group of people who wouldn't be at the mall when you're collecting data. Therefore, we would say that there is an error in sample and it doesn't represent the entire population. Therefore, it's invalid to trust the result from the collecting data. Now we have covered all 4 types of bias, and let's check what you have learned. Answer the following questions. Question 1. What kind of bias is present in the situation below? If high school children are asked in the presence of their parents whether they have ever smoked a cigarette, then they are likely to deny smoking even if they have smoked. You can take about 30 seconds to come up with the answer, and you can pause the video if you want to. Let's check the answer. So answer would be response bias. Since the design of survey can possibly influence or affect the sample, we would say it's invalid data because the presence of parents will make them hard to answer with honesty. So therefore, the sample contains response bias. Let's move on to the next question. Question 2. Identify what types of biases are presented in the situation below. Try to find at least 2 biases. In many African countries, less than 4% of households have telephones, and those that do are often affluent. A telephone survey there would give biased results. So take about 30 seconds to answer. You can pause the video if you want. Let's check the answer. So the answer was undercoverage bias and non-response bias. Since only 4% of the entire population have telephones, if we conduct telephone survey, then it's hard to say that it covers entire population in Africa. And it also fails to represent entire population because it undercover about 96% of entire population. Therefore, the data is inaccurate and cannot represent entire population. So let's take a look at question 3. What kind of bias is present in the situation below? An interviewer asks, the American Dental Association recommends brushing your teeth 3 times a day. How often do you brush your teeth on a typical day? The respondents may feel compelled to give an answer of 3 or more, even if they don't brush their teeth that often. So the responses are likely to be higher than the true average of the population. Take about 30 seconds to answer. You can pause the video if you want. So the answer is response bias, and I already kind of explained it while I was teaching you guys about the response bias concept. Question 4. What kind of bias is present in situation below? Miss K assigned her algebra class to survey what people prefer to learn in next year's math classes. Student H decides to ask students who eat lunch in the cafeteria. However, student N refuses to answer since he wants to only concentrate on eating lunch rather than talking to surveyor. Take about 30 seconds to answer. You can pause the video if you want. The answer is non-response bias, since a large fraction of sampled failed to respond because student H only try to ask students who eat lunch in cafeteria. It fails to cover those who eat lunch in park or outside of school or even outside of cafeteria. Therefore, it's hard to say they represent entire population, and therefore it's inaccurate as well. Question 5. Listen carefully to the question and answer. A survey is administered to a random sample of participants. Which of the following does not describe a potential form of bias? A. The survey asks about teenagers' tendency to text and drive and is administered in front of the teenagers' parents. B. A small portion of the administered surveys are returned. C. A study is meant to describe the behavior of high school students in general, but is only administered to girls. D. The population of a high school is divided into non-homogeneous groups, which means it contains various characteristics, and 10 surveys are administered to a random sample from each cluster, which means each group. E. A question in the survey states, most teenagers know texting while driving is bad. How often do you text and drive? Take about 30 seconds to answer. You can pause the video if you want. So the answer is D. Let's take a closer look at why the answer is D. Answer choice A contains response bias since the design of survey somewhat impacts the sample because there are presence of parents, then they're less likely to be honest. Answer choice B contains non-response bias since only small portion of sample answer to the survey questions. Answer choice C contains undercoverage bias since it only asks girls and it failed to represent the boys' opinions. Answer choice E contains response bias since the wording of question that says most teenagers know texting while driving is bad kind of impacts the sample's answer, and they will be likely to answer with less honesty. Now you're done with the quiz questions. Yay! So now let's come back to the question that I asked you guys before we start the actual lesson about bias. Student K from CCV Middle School wants to know who is the most popular person. Student K puts question sheet that says, for 3 years, student R was the most popular person in CCV Middle School. Who is the most popular person in CCV Middle School this year? And 50 post-its on cafeteria table, which is closest to the door. He collected the post-its after lunch, and the result was student R. Do you think student R is the most popular person in CCV Middle School, and the result is valid? The answer is that it is not valid. Explain why this sample is not valid to support the result according to the lesson that you have learned. Apparently, it is not valid since it contains all 4 types of bias. It contains response bias due to the wording of the question. It also has non-response bias since there is no guarantee that majority of students answer to K's question. It also contains undercoverage bias since not every students are eating lunch in cafeteria. At last, it has voluntary response bias since the survey was based on volunteering to answer, and those with extreme opinions tend to voluntarily answer to the question. So that's all I prepared for you guys today. If you guys have any question, leave comment or contact me. Thank you for watching.